This jacket makes me look like your rich auntie. It's not wrong. Hi, I'm Legia. I'm a real-life attorney, and I'm on a mission to demystify the law and how it affects your everyday life. Want to get started? Today I want to talk to you about Tick-Tock. Specifically, I want to talk to you about what's going on with Tick-Tock and whether Trump actually has authority to ban Tick-Tock, because that seems to be a common question, especially amongst TikTokers today. So let's get into it. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please give this video a thumbs up if you find it useful, and hit the subscribe button if you want to see more from me. I'd also like to offer the following disclaimer, and that is that I am a lawyer, but I am not your lawyer, and this is not legal advice. You should seek out the advice of a licensed attorney before making any legal decisions. This is for educational and entertainment purposes only. In case you live under a rock, let me just explain to you what Tick-Tock is. Tick-Tock is a social media platform where you can post videos that are between 15 and 60 seconds long. They can be about anything under the sun, and they are from dances to karaoke to fun animal videos to videos of toads sitting at tiny fruit stands to recipes. It's a really wonderful wonderland of entertainment that has provided a lot of solace for people, especially during this pandemic. TikTok is largely popular with a younger demographic of people, Gen Z if you want to call them that. However, a lot of millennials have gotten really into it, especially during the pandemic. So it has a pretty wide appeal, and it is one of the most popular apps in the world. It's been downloaded 2 billion times. TikTok is owned by parent company ByteDance, which is a Chinese company based in Beijing. And that's kind of the source of all of TikTok's problems right now. So basically, in the United States, we're very leery of China. It's not completely unfounded because China does value personal liberties less than we do here in the United States. They are more predisposed towards censorship of their citizens, and as Americans, we hate censorship. We want free speech for everyone, always and absolutely. That's not actually how the First Amendment works. There's no such thing really as an absolute right to things, because in a society where there's more than one person, your rights have to be balanced against the rights of another person, because if you have the absolute right to do something, that's probably going to infringe on another person's right to be free from whatever it is you're doing. So while your First Amendment right to free speech and free expression is not absolute, it is a highly valued right that we have here in the United States that is more restricted in China. And the Chinese government has a lot more control over certain aspects of China's citizens as well as its businesses. So specifically, the United States has looked into TikTok over national security fears, specifically that TikTok would be able to spy on certain military personnel in order to gain intelligence, or would be able to collect enough data on US citizens that it might be able to influence politics or elections, which is similar to what happened during the 2016 election and Facebook and the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal. And TikTok is currently under review by the Committee of Foreign Investments in the United States, which is a branch of the US Treasury Department. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the data that TikTok is collecting is being sent to TikTok's parent company ByteDance in Beijing, and under what's known as the China Internet Security Law, ByteDance doesn't have any authority to restrict Chinese government officials from accessing the data that TikTok collects on its users. This China Internet Security Law gives the Chinese government authority to spot check or look in on certain data collected by private companies within China's borders, and allows the Chinese government access to the data pretty much in an unrestricted way. So because of these fears over national security in the United States and the data that TikTok is sending to China of US citizens, Trump has declared that he intends to ban TikTok. This declaration was then put on hold once Microsoft went into talks to purchase at least the US and English-speaking branches of TikTok, supposedly to help lessen fears that data is being sent to China if the US branch of TikTok is owned by a US company. However, again, I would like to point out that the Cambridge Analytica scandal that led to election tampering in 2016 happened because of Facebook's data, Facebook being a United States company. So I think an overarching theme in this video and in this TikTok issue is that while China does definitely censor its citizens and private companies more than in the United States. Just because data is being sent to China doesn't mean that it's more risky than data that is being kept in US servers. Data in US servers is still just as vulnerable as any other data to being hacked and to being exploited. A large overarching question is whether Trump even has the authority to ban TikTok in the first place. The short answer is that he does. So Trump is claiming authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and it would be helpful to back up a little bit and talk about the background of this act to give you a better idea of how this act fits into our history as a country, because it spans the past century and indicates an expansion of presidential power that is beyond what Congress originally intended. The precursor to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which I will be calling IEEPA here on out, which is not really easier to say, but is at least fewer syllables. Before the IEEPA, there was the TWEA, and that stands for Trading with the Enemies Act. So let's go back to World War I. That's right, the 19 teens. And the country entered the First World War that required certain emergency powers be given to the president so that he could exercise economic control over certain aspects of the economy in wartime. Congress passed a number of statutes granting the president authority to exercise control over private property during wartime, including the TWEA. The TWEA specifically granted the president a lot of control over international communications and assets and things that involved investments and communications between the US and its enemies. Enemies was very broadly defined as anyone with whom the US was at war or anyone doing business with anyone with whom the US was at war. So it's a pretty wide swath of the world at this point, especially in World War I, and it gave the president a lot of power over private assets during times of war. Then, during the Great Depression, the TWEA was expanded to grant the president even more power during peacetime so that he could declare states of emergency and take control over international assets as a means of combating the economic crisis at the time. So at this time, the president was FDR, and he used a lot of rhetoric that kind of made the economic crisis seem war-like, like it was an attack on the United States. People needed to be mobilized. They had to combat against this economic depression. FDR even asked Congress for, and I quote, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. So basically, they're likening this economic crisis of the Great Depression to a war and saying the president needs these extensive powers to seize private assets internationally in order to be able to combat this great foe that is this economic depression. This might sound a little similar to the current crisis of the pandemic that's happening, which has always been talked about in warlike terms of combat and we're under attack and things like that. It's a common strategy used to liken crises and emergencies to war, because I think the only way we know how to deal with emergencies is by looking at them as though they are warlike? I think that's a psychological question that's maybe for another day though. So then, after the Great Depression, we got World War II. And again, here's another emergency, this time actually during war, where a president is going to need more economic power to control private assets to try to sway the war in the United States' favor. So then came the Cold War, which gave even further reason to enact economic powers over private property, especially in the form of embargoes against countries like Vietnam, Cuba, North Korea, and China, communist countries basically. So during the Cold War, this power under the TWEA was expanded even more and often invoked in the case of embargoes. So the TWEA, enacted during World War I, was invoked by virtually every single president from World War I through the 1970s, during both wartime but also in times of peace, and was used as a means to take hold of large amounts of foreign assets or control certain aspects of the US economy as it related to international enemies. Then, however, in the 1970s, Watergate happened, which created a new wave of congressional oversight over presidential powers because people realized that there was a lot of corrupt things happening at the presidential or in the executive branch that needed more congressional oversight. Because of this, Congress started looking in more deeply to presidential powers that maybe were over-delegated to the presidents throughout the years, and this included the TWEA, which had expanded largely beyond its original intention, which was to give President Wilson powers during World War I to help control the economy in times of war. During the course of this investigation into presidential power, they found that the United States had been in a state of emergency under the the TWEA virtually unstopped since 1933. That's 40 years of pretty much unfettered economic power in the president's hands under the TWEA. One congressman described the TWEA as conferring, quote, on the president what could have been dictatorial powers that he could have used without any restraint by Congress. There was a House report done in preparation for legislation to reform the TWEA that referred to that act as, quote, essentially an unlimited grant of authority for the president to exercise at his discretion broad powers in both the domestic and international economic arena without congressional review. So basically, the TWEA was granting the president powers beyond that which ever should have been granted to the president under the Constitution. Congress really had very little oversight into what the president was doing under the TWEA, so Congress wanted to reform that law to put it back in line with the Constitution and congressional oversight powers. So to that end, Congress enacted in 1978 the National Emergencies Act along with the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or the IEEPA. Along with these acts, Congress ended nearly all existing national emergencies, the ones that had been around for the last 40 years, and they enacted greater congressional oversight into the declaration of national emergencies as well as the administration of economic powers of the president. It required that the president actually notify Congress anytime he wanted to declare a national emergency, and it required that Congress review every year the national emergencies currently standing to determine whether they should be ongoing or if Congress should end them, which Congress was allowed to do under these new acts by joint resolution. The TWEA still existed under these new acts, however, it was limited back down to only apply to times of war, which was how it was originally intended to be. The IEEPA, on the other hand, allowed for national emergencies to be declared in peacetime. However, again, it required greater congressional oversight, and according to the act, these emergencies should be rare and brief, and, I quote, a state of national emergency should not be a normal state of affairs, end quote. So the IEEPA grants the president the authority to use or prohibit any property in which any foreign national or country has any interest, basically. Property, the word property is interpreted pretty broadly and can include intangible property like intellectual property, trademark, things like that, but also technological property, such as an app, for example. And these powers that the president has can be used to address any unusual and extraordinary threat to national security coming from outside the United States. So any international threat can be addressed as long as it's unusual and extraordinary. The act requires that the president consult with Congress at every possible instance while implementing powers conferred to him under the IEEPA. So again, the IEEPA was enacted after extensive review of the amount of presidential power given under the TWEA and was meant to create a lot more congressional oversight into whether national emergencies were declared, how long that they lasted, and the extent of presidential powers. However, a look at the lasting impact of the IEEPA and how it's evolved over the years indicates that this check on presidential power has kind of been undone again, the same way that the TWEA was. Since 1978, presidents have invoked the IEEPA in 59 national emergencies. The average length of these emergencies is 9 years or more, and 33 of these emergencies are still ongoing. In the beginning, all of the national emergencies that were declared were very geographically specific. However, since the 1990s, these declarations have become a lot more broad. They haven't been targeted at a specific geographic location, but instead have been targeted at larger issues such as terrorism or cyber threats, and so have granted a wider swath of authority to the president. Also, these national emergencies have become greater and greater in length as the decades have gone on. So a national emergency declared now under the IEEPA is going to last a lot longer on average than national emergencies that were declared back in the 70s and 80s. These two factors combined means that the president's authority under the IEEPA has become broader and longer as the years have gone on, which was the exact issue that Congress was trying to address when it passed the IEEPA. However, a lot of these emergency declarations and uses of presidential power under the IEEPA have been ratified by Congress or have been accepted by Congress as within the president's purview as granted under the Act. So even though it seems that the president's power has been extended beyond what Congress originally intended when passing the IEEPA, it seems as though Congress has been okay with this expansion because it has acquiesced to the president's exercise of powers throughout the years. And the US Supreme Court has even supported this expansion. In the case Dames and Moore v. Reagan, the US Supreme Court said that, well, Congress has allowed the presidents to exercise these broader amounts of control under the act, and even though there are specific instances of presidential power being exercised that aren't explicitly allowed in the act, that doesn't mean that it's against congressional intent. Congress can't just have predicted every single instance in which a president might use the IEEPA, and because Congress has pretty much allowed the president to do whatever he wants with the IEEPA, then it's not within the purview of the court to say that it should be more restricted or that the president is going outside of the bounds of his power. As far as the constitutionality of the IEEPA, courts have found that it does not violate, for example, the non-delegation doctrine of the Constitution, which restricts Congress from granting to the president powers that are explicitly reserved for Congress, stating that Congress just needs to give an intelligible principle that provides guidance as to how a president is supposed to exercise the powers that have been given to him. And because the act has that intelligible principle, then it's fine, and it's not an overreach or an overextension of Congress's delegation powers. Courts have also found that it's not a taking under the Fifth Amendment. Basically, the Fifth Amendment takings clause bans the government from taking private property without just compensation. So the government can't come in and say, give me your land, without compensating you. So similarly, one would think that the president would not be able to go to a foreign company doing business in the United States and say, give me your assets, without just compensation. However, courts have reasoned that this exercise of power under the IEEPA is similar to an embargo or something like that, or a tariff, and those have never been found to be unconstitutional. The courts reason that, embargoes and tariffs are considered justified, so an exercise of power under the IEEPA would similarly be justified. Despite it maybe having negative impact on private property, it still is justified, similarly to an embargo or a tariff. There's also the issue of procedural due process. Procedural due process promises that you will receive notice and a hearing should your life, liberty, or property be taken by the government. Courts have found that in these situations, national security interests trump any procedural due process claims against the IEEPA. And then most prominently, especially in the Tick-Tock case, is First Amendment concerns, that is the right to free speech and free expression. So at least with regards to the IEEPA, courts have found that where a restriction is based both on speech and non-speech, meaning it's regulating speech, yes, but it's also regulating something else. In Tick-Tock's case, it's regulating speech, yes, because it's regulating the creation of videos and your ability to produce them and publish them on TikTok's platform, but it's also regulating non-speech, that is the app itself, and the asset that is the business of the app and ByteDance's business in the United States. So if it's regulating both speech and non-speech, and it furthers a governmental interest that is not related to constricting speech rights, as long as the restriction to First Amendment freedoms is no greater than necessary to the furtherance of that legitimate state interest, then it's fine. So put a little bit more simply, basically if it's regulating speech but it's also regulating something else and the government has a legitimate interest in that and hasn't specifically said that it's trying to constrict free speech, it's probably fine. It's also probably fine because TikTok is not your only means of communicating with 15 to 60 second videos. You have Instagram, you have Facebook. It's not a full, broad restriction on speech of this type. There are other means to communicate in this way, not just through TikTok. And the regulation isn't content specific, so it's not saying that you can't make this type of speech, or it's not trying to regulate certain types of speech. In fact, it's not trying to regulate any type of speech, at least not on its face. The intent of the ban is another issue, but it's very hard for a court to guess or infer what the intent of a ban like this would be, and it's easy for the government to argue that the ban is not meant to, block people from speaking, but instead to further a legitimate interest of national security. So in this case, it would likely not be a violation of the First Amendment. So no president as of yet has invoked the IEEPA to take an action that's primarily domestic in nature, and this TikTok ban would likely be primarily domestic in nature because it's only banning TikTok within the United States. However, due to the increasing globalization of the world, most economic transactions could probably be considered to be foreign and international in character, such that it would fall under the IEEPA. And this is actually a big criticism that scholars have against the IEEPA, which is that globalization has made it so that pretty much any transaction would fall under this international categorization, such that a president could just exercise any sort of control he wanted under the purview of the IEEPA. Also, there's no specific definition of what constitutes a national emergency and what constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat. So presidents have been able to interpret these words in the statute really broadly and kind of grab hold of a lot more power. And like I said, the use of the IEEPA has been expanding over the years, and the length of emergencies and as well as the numerosity of emergencies has also expanded. But to give you a little context, Obama invoked the IEEPA 43 times in 8 years. Trump has invoked the IEEPA 22 times in 3 years. So Trump's use of the IEEPA is pretty much in line with the trends in recent administrations. So this is the statute that Trump is claiming he has authority under to ban TikTok, and he's not wrong. But is there really a reason to ban TikTok more than there is to ban any other social networking site? Basically, my point is that TikTok is probably spying on you about the same amount that any other social networking site is spying on you. You are valuable to TikTok because you are feeding into the algorithm, and it's able to tell what you like and what you're going to respond well to, and it can use that to target ads at you and to make more money. Because the better a program is at targeting ads to you, the more likely you are to click on it, and a company is to make money off of that. So a company is more likely to pay more to that platform to put ads on the platform. So your data is valuable mainly because of advertisements. However, TikTok is able to spy on specific personnel, potentially within the military, and TikTok is able to gather demographic information. So if you are a certain type of person, you fall into a certain category, they are able to say, well, this type of person responds this way to certain content. And so using that information, it's very easy to see how if the Chinese government was able to get their hands on this information, they would be able to then tailor content specifically towards US consumers to try to influence, for example, an election, much like what happened with Cambridge Analytica in 2016. However, like I said before, the Cambridge Analytica scandal that allowed for the influence over the 2016 election happened because of Facebook, a US-based company. So it's not really clear that just because your information is in China necessarily means it is less secure than your information on any other social networking platform. So what can you do as a user of TikTok? I'm not really insinuating here that you should go off the grid completely and just try to hide your entire identity from the internet. Partially because that's not really a realistic way to live your life in 2020, but also partially because it's literally not possible to a certain extent to be completely anonymous and have absolutely none of your data on the internet. What I am suggesting you do is be smart. Keep really strong passwords and keep them together in a password protecting program such as Keeper or something like that. Change your passwords often. Don't give out your phone number or address, and don't post videos or other information or photos that might give away where you live or where you go on a day-to-day basis. Know the terms of service and privacy policies of the social media networks that you're joining. Read them. They're pretty easy to read and understand, and you should know what you're signing on to. And most importantly, don't believe everything you read on the internet. Be an informed consumer. Look to multiple sources, question everything that you're seeing, and think before you share viral content. It's our duty as consumers to be smart and not to allow misinformation to guide us into making incorrect or misinformed decisions, especially on election day. And while I'm saying that, I'm not trying to call fake news on everything. I think that there are a number of well-established news outlets that do vetting and that are really responsible in what they're publishing. But I am saying that even when you do read those sources, read more than one source. Cross-reference what you're reading and make sure that it's not being reported differently based on different news outlets. If it is, you should at least look at it with a critical eye and say, okay, I don't have enough information yet to create a fully formed opinion at this point. Or if you see something like a meme or a informational chart or a video that seems sensational, question it. It probably is sensational because it's not telling the whole story. Usually the whole story is a little bit more boring than this sensationalized version. So do your research, think before you share, try to understand the reality of that we're living in a time when technology has advanced to the point where a lot of information can be falsified, images can be altered, videos can be altered, so you can't always believe everything you see. So be smart, be informed, and think before you share. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more from me. Comment below if you have other questions about things going on in the world and how the law affects them. I'm happy to look into things and do research and try to help you and myself understand kind of what's going on in the world and how the law is affecting it. I love doing it. That's why I'm on here, and I'm here to help. So hit me up. Thanks for joining. Bye.